There we go. So welcome everybody. Just some quick notes here. So we've got, first of all, we got Jim Sikora on, who's at Lander Home. I mean, he's presented for us in the past and does an awesome job. He's here to give us some updates in a great title. We were working on this a couple months ago and we thought, well, maybe this will be good timing. And I think we probably hit it about as close as we could get on having a good check-in time on some updates, because we know that there's going to be more that's coming along. This is being recorded, so we're going to keep everyone's video and audio off. Feel free to use the chat log if you have any questions. We're going to send these out along with Jim's contact information. So if you have specific details that you don't feel that you want to bring up in the chat log, that's fine. You'll have his contact information available. I'm going to turn my video off just so you guys don't have to stare at me during this presentation, but pop on here and there. I'll moderate the chat, but Jim, I'm going to hand it over to you and go ahead and do your thing.
All right, thanks, Tyson. Appreciate the introduction. Appreciate you facilitating this today, and thanks for everybody for being here. I know we're smack dab in the middle of a Tuesday morning, but as Tyson said, him and I were chatting before, before we started this, and just talking about the timing of this presentation, how it really couldn't have been much better given the developments over the past couple of days. So I'm going to try to get through as much as I can, but also encourage you to ask questions as we go, given kind of the circumstances we're in with some of the new guidance related to masks and other workplace safety measures. I want to try to answer as many questions as I can, because I know most of you you probably have a lot of questions. Before I go ahead and jump in and get started, I want to just kind of give you my lawyer disclaimer here. This is really intended to be informational only. It's not intended to be specific legal advice. If you have specific questions about your circumstances or a specific situation you're dealing with, we should talk offline about that. The other kind of maybe obvious caveat here is this is based on, everything I say today is based on current information. Things are changing very rapidly. For all I know, everything I'm talking about right now could be out of date as we talk, just given the way things change at the moment. But I did check as of about 15 minutes ago. We don't have any new guidance that I saw on the mask issue following the CDC guidance last week, but keep an eye out for updates, because we will be seeing some updates in the next couple of days, and feel free to ask questions as we go, like I said. So with that being said, see if I can move on to the next slide here. I think we've all been attuned to the news and the fact that the CDC released some new guidance regarding mask wearing late last week. I think it came out on Thursday at about lunchtime Pacific time. It was quite a surprise. I don't think anyone really expected it. I started seeing some rumblings Thursday morning that it was coming out, and then it came out I think Thursday afternoon. I apologize if I got the days mixed up, but it was sometime late last week. Because it was a surprise, and because I understand that the news reporting is the CDC didn't necessarily consult with state and local officials on it, we're in this kind of weird limbo stage where the new CDC guidance has rendered a lot of the state and local guidance kind of irrelevant, or not irrelevant, but it made it outdated, I guess is a more accurate word. So employers are in this weird, difficult spot where we have the CDC guidance, which both Oregon and Washington have indicated that they're going to adopt, but haven't had time to do so yet. And we have the existing state and local guidance that applies to employers, as well as the Oregon OSHA and the LNI guidance. It also applies to employers. So we are in this weird limbo stage. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means for you right now, and then maybe what we can expect in the next couple of days as the state and local governments scramble to catch up and issue updated guidance. First, I just want to briefly touch on the CDC's updated guidance. I'm sure you've all seen this nifty little graphic that the CDC put out with their new guidance. Obviously, the big surprise here is that they eliminated the mask recommendation for fully vaccinated individuals, and fully vaccinated means you're 2 weeks past your second shot of the 2-shot vaccines, or 2 weeks past your first shot, or your only shot of, I guess, of the single shot Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There are some exceptions to that recommendation for fully vaccinated individuals. That includes things like public transportation, air travel, and situations where state and local guidance provides otherwise, which is what we'll really talk about in more detail in a second. And then on the other side of the screen there, you see the updated recommendations for unvaccinated individuals. There are a couple of situations where the CDC's recommending that unvaccinated individuals can go without a mask, but as you can see, a majority of situations, they're still recommending that unvaccinated individuals continue to wear a mask as they have been doing. So moving on to, let's see here. What's next for Oregon and Washington? As I mentioned, both Governor Inslee and Governor Brown indicated that their respective states were going to adopt the CDC guidance. We don't actually have updated guidance yet. And before I launch into that, Tyson, can we run that first poll on what folks are doing currently regarding the mask usage? I think you're on mute, Tyson.
Yeah, hold on a second. I just have to.
I sprung that on you pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, it's all right. Let me. It says I'm not logged in, but I'm here.
I can keep going.
Yeah, so since you're a co-host, can you see on the bottom there where it says polls, right to the left of that share screen?
Yeah.
Okay, click on that and then hit launch. And I'll try to fix my.
Okay, I'm actually going to wait on this. I'll run that in a second.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned earlier, we are waiting for guidance from Washington and Oregon. Until we get that updated guidance, I've spent a lot of time looking at this over the weekend and yesterday and this morning, as well as kind of talking to colleagues and looking at what a lot of employment lawyers are commenting on in regards to what employers should do while we're in this limbo stage. And technically, the existing mask guidance in Oregon and Washington remain in effect. So I think the safest course of action is to maintain the status quo for the time being. Until we get the updated guidance from the state level on what employers can do in the workforce. I know a lot of people have been saying, well, but Jim, the CDC changed the guidance saying fully vaccinated individuals can go without a mask. Why would we continue to have people wear masks? It's been all over the news all weekend, and I get it. But a couple of things to keep in mind: the CDC's guidance is just that, it's guidance. Even though the CDC is our primary public health agency on a nationwide basis, the CDC doesn't have primary jurisdiction over workplace safety, and the agencies primarily responsible for workplace safety are LNI in Washington and Oregon OSHA in Oregon, as well as the state and local officials who have issued the emergency orders and things like that. So I believe the safest course of action is to wait until that local level guidance is updated before you go ahead and make any significant changes to your masking policy. One of the questions I've fielded over the past couple of days is, if you drop the mask requirement now for your employees, is there risk there? I think the best answer to that that we have at the moment is arguably yes. I could see kind of a worst case scenario where you are in this limbo stage where we don't have the updated guidance from the state agencies and you have an outbreak in the workplace. Could an employee who got sick or, worst case scenario would maybe die from that COVID outbreak, could they come back and, make arguments that you weren't following applicable guidelines? I think they could. There's a fair amount of uncertainty about that because we do have CDC guidance, which again is guidance, but it's certainly relevant. But we also, on the flip side, have the L&I requirements that remain in place and the Oregon OSHA requirements that remain in place. So given that uncertainty and given the tension, or even maybe more accurately, the conflict between the various guidance we have out there, I think your safest course of action is just to stay on the current course you're on, because again, we should have new guidance in the next couple of days, hopefully, knock on wood. So I want to run that poll. Let's see here.
Yeah, so you hit the polls button,
Okay.
and then poll one should already be there. And if you just hit launch, that should get going from there.
Okay, great. So just kind of curious, this is trying to get a sense of where people are at with regard to what they're planning on doing with masks moving forward in light of the new guidance or the expected new guidance. Thought it'd be useful for everybody on the call to kind of see what others are thinking. And it looks like as we get responses in an overwhelming majority so far, and I'll let this run for a little while longer, we're just going to wait, which okay.
You can present the answers, or if you want.
Okay, I'll get a couple more seconds here. So if I hit end poll, Tyson, that'll just pop up and show.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, we got most people that have responded, and just keep in mind this is anonymous, so no one's going to see what you've answered individually.
Oh.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So looks like we have a few folks who have maybe made a decision to not require masks or are planning on not requiring them moving forward. A handful have said that they're going to continue to require masks, and the overwhelming majority, about 61%, said wait for further guidance at the state level, which, as I mentioned earlier, I do think at the moment that is your best course of action.
So one question that came through, Jim, just in this, I think this is just good to clarify, because there's a lot of questions going on. So it's asking about the guidelines for people who are currently vaccinated. So what are, isn't that a personal decision to be vaccinated, or is it illegal to ask or mandate people to be vaccinated? This question has come up a lot.
Yeah, and so it obviously is a personal decision whether or not you receive the vaccine. There is no mandate at the government level that individuals have to receive the vaccine. So it is a personal decision. Generally, yes, employers can require employees to be vaccinated. I'm going to dig into that in a bit more detail in my next topic. So I'm going to pin that for now on the details of the employer mandated vaccines. So
then, and maybe this will come up later, but just asking the question, though, isn't illegal of whether they're vaccinated or not.
It is not. The baseline question of asking an employee, are you vaccinated or not, is permissible. It's not considered a medical inquiry under disability law. If you go the next step, if they say, no, I'm not vaccinated, and you ask, well, why aren't you vaccinated? You're now starting to trend into territory which could be considered a medical inquiry under disability law. And you need to be a little bit more cautious there, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail.
Great. Good stuff. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see here. I kind of lost my spot in my slides, but so as I mentioned, and we're waiting for the guidance at the state level. A majority of you are also waiting for that guidance to make further decisions. But what can you do in the meantime? I think number one, it's a good opportunity to continue or encourage employees to get vaccinated. Also, I think communication right now is pretty key. It's been key throughout this, the whole pandemic, but maybe letting employees know, if you haven't already, that you're aware of the new guidance, you're evaluating it, and you'll be sending some updates in the next couple of days. There's a lot of conflicting information out there about what this means in the workplace, whether masks are still required, those kinds of things. So maybe there might be some anxiety, some uncertainty amongst your employees, and communication might help address that. Tyson, did you have a question?
Yeah, so just a clarification on is that do the employees have to answer the question, yes or no, or whether they've been vaccinated or not? And maybe the follow-up to that is what happens if they just refuse to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it depends on what your policy is regarding vaccinations. If you have a vaccine mandate and an employee refuses to answer the question, then you have a decision to make about whether that employee is going to continue in employment or not. You need to be a little bit cautious there about disability and religious accommodation issues, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. But that's one of the tricky things about a vaccine mandate. If you don't have a vaccine mandate and you're just asking because you want to get a sense of what percentage of your workforce is, say, vaccinated, to help you kind of gauge what your reopening plans are going to be, then that is a voluntary disclosure, and the employee would have the ability to elect to disclose that information or not. So a couple of things to think about as we wait for the updated guidance from the state. The state's on the usage of masks in the workplace. If you're going to drop the mask requirement, again, assuming that Oregon and Washington allow employers to do that for vaccinated individuals, you need to start to think about, how am I going to verify who's vaccinated or not? We've already answered a few questions about inquiring into that issue, but I see three kind of primary options for verifying vaccination status for purposes of mask usage going forward. Number one is obviously to require proof of vaccination. As we talked about a minute ago, I think this is the safest option. You're going to get a copy of that vaccine card or something else confirming that vaccination has been completed by the employee. There is some possible downsides, as you guys have already asked questions about, in terms of employees. Some employees might be reluctant to share information, but you do have some options there for maybe making it voluntary. I already mentioned that you can ask that question, so it's a permissible question: are you vaccinated or not vaccinated? But if you do require proof of vaccination for an employee to take off their mask, then any information you have regarding vaccination status should be kept confidential, separate and apart from the employee's personnel file, just like you would handle any other information about medical type issues for employees. Your second option for verifying vaccination status is to ask the employee to sign some type of verification or attestation that they received the vaccine. I really don't know, whether this is a good option or not. It's just an option that I saw people discussing, and one that I thought of as well. This is a little bit more, well, it is a lot more reliant on the employee being truthful than requiring actual proof of vaccination, but it might come across as a little less intrusive. And those folks who are on the fence, maybe a little bit reluctant to share information about it or share the card for whatever reason, maybe might be a little bit more willing to sign some type of verification that they received the vaccine. And the third option is just the honor system. This is the simplest approach, but it's obviously the one that's most prone to abuse. I also think it's possible that Washington and Oregon might require something more than the honor system, at least for employees. I know there was some discussion in Oregon over the weekend about Oregon potentially requiring businesses to check customers or members of the public's vaccine cards before they let them in without a mask. I think there was some blowback on that. Just even, setting aside any political questions, I think there's a logistical issue there. If you're going to the Walmart or Safeway or wherever else, you could just see the long queues that would be outside the store while they check vaccine cards. So I wouldn't expect that, but you might see a little bit more of a stringent requirement for employees verifying their vaccination status for purposes of taking off the mask. I do think if you're gonna look at either in the near future or maybe a little bit down the road of moving towards a situation where you allow vaccinated employees to be in the workplace without a mask, I think there probably is some risk if you don't take reasonable steps to verify vaccination status. Again, this is all really new. We don't have precedent for this, but I think an employer would be expected to at least take some reasonable measures to ensure that the people who are taking off their masks are actually fully vaccinated. Is the honor system reasonable? I don't know. I think it's vulnerable to attack. I think the written confirmation is a step up. It's a little bit better. And then obviously, I think your best option there in terms of taking reasonable steps is to verify vaccination status. One of the other common questions is, what about employees that still want to wear masks, whether you move to no mask for vaccinated employees now or down the road? I think the best approach is going to be allow employees to continue to wear masks if they want to. Comfort levels vary quite significantly from person to person. Individual risk levels vary quite a lot. So I think it's best just to allow people time to adjust within their comfort levels. It's been a long year for, I guess, over a year now for all of us. And so maybe allowing people time just to kind of transition back into a little bit more of a environment is a good idea. Is there a question?
Yeah, just a question around storing the information and what separate means from the employee file, because clearly you're going to have to attach it to an employee. So it's going to be an employee file and storing the answer or the card or however you're collecting that information.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on your record keeping system. But one option that comes to mind is just you could just have a file that has the verifications in them. If you already have an existing confidential file for employees, which many employers do, for things like, say, leave of absences, those kinds of things, you could just slide your verification into that file. That's probably your best option, actually.
Cool, thank you.
One other thing to think about moving forward as you evaluate whether you want to move away from masks for fully vaccinated employees or not is just some of the potential downstream effects that different mask requirements could have in the workplace. One legal potential effect is discrimination issues. I did see yesterday that the EEOC indicated that it's going to release some updated guidance to address the CDC's new guidance. So again, it's another agency that's scrambling to catch up. But there are some potential discrimination issues there in relation to employees with disabilities or certain religious beliefs, as well as just kind of the stigma that could be attached to individuals who, for whatever reason, choose not to get the vaccine or are unable to get the vaccine, and then they have to wear masks, and their other coworkers aren't wearing a mask. There could be a bit of a stigma associated with that, then, which could lead into certain types of unfair treatment situations or discrimination situations, or whatever that will be. You could kind of see how that would snowball. So it's just something to kind of another factor to think about. And again, keep an eye out for updated guidance from the EEOC and the state agencies on that front as well. Okay. I'm going to move on to just briefly touch on current status in Washington for reopening, because I think it's important, because June 30th will be here much more quickly than I think many of us expect at the moment. But following the CDC's update on Thursday, Governor Inslee came out and moved all the counties to phase 3. Clark County was already in phase 3, I believe, so it's not a change for those of us in Clark County. But the big news was he set a June 30th reopening goal of 70% or more of folks in Washington who are 16 years of age and older initiate vaccination. If we hit that number before June 30, then I believe he said that we would also reopen at that point in time. I think Oregon set a similar goal. I can't remember off the top of my head whether it's June 30 or not, but I do know that they set a metric as well for vaccine initiation, and that would trigger the full reopening phase. While we are in phase 3 in Washington, most indoor activities remain capped at about 50% operating capacity. So things like certain offices and restaurants and things like that are still capped at about 50%. So I want to move on to talk about vaccine mandates, and I kind of jumped the gun on this, but there is a bit more meat on this bone, so to speak. Obviously, the question was, can you mandate the vaccine? The answer is yes, under the at-will employment doctrine, both in Oregon and Washington. An employer can set work rules, one of which would be a vaccine mandate. There are, as I mentioned, and we'll discuss in a minute, exceptions for disabilities and religious beliefs. And for any of you in Oregon who might be a healthcare provider, you're probably aware of the quirk in Oregon law that limits a healthcare provider's ability to mandate vaccines for certain employees. But except for those narrow exceptions, employers do have the ability to mandate vaccines. There have been some efforts in state legislatures to pass legislation to prohibit employers from doing so. I think one was in the Washington legislature that failed. I'm not aware of any in Oregon or not, but I wouldn't expect either Oregon and Washington to pass that type of prohibition. But again, it's just another one of those things to keep an eye on in case something would come up. So I want to run a poll here before we move on. See what folks are doing for vaccines. One of the questions I get a lot from the clients I work with is what are employers doing for vaccines? So this is another thing I thought it'd be helpful for all of you, just to kind of get a sense of what others in the community are doing with regard to vaccine mandates, or maybe encouraging, or just not taking a position on it. So I'm going to give that a little bit of time to run. And Tyson, was there a question while we do that?
Yeah, this question's kind of come up in a couple different ways, but if you did ask for whether they're vaccinated or not, who can you share that with? And say managers or whatever, because if they're having to, let's say the mask, you're able to take masks off in certain locations or whatever, well, clearly someone's going to have to be there monitoring whether someone that's not supposed to be doing that is doing that. So who can you share it with?
That's a great question. I think the best approach is those on a need-to-know basis. And I know that's a lawyer answer, but it really depends on the circumstances, like you indicated, Tyson. There's going to be certain folks that need to know so they can continue to enforce the existing safety rules. So if that's your, depending on the nature of your operation, it might be some of your frontline supervisors or just upper management, those kinds of things. So I guess the most direct way of answering that is those folks who need to know to enforce the workplace safety rules regarding masks would be the ones you'd share it with.
Yeah, I've heard it another way too, or on top of that is that the people that are doing also have to manage the question of why can't come up. And so they have to be responsible for that too. Otherwise, that's when you start getting into some trouble.
Yeah, so typically I'm gonna end this poll and publish the results. So it looks like in the poll, Again, an overwhelming majority are encouraging employees to get the vaccine, but not requiring it. A few are mandating it, and a few just aren't taking a position on it at all. Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that information. Tyson, what was the question about the why? Can you ask that again?
So what we were talking about before is it's not the matter of whether you can ask or not. It's really, that's not where the violation comes. It's when you ask the question, well, why haven't you done it? And so if you start giving someone authority to know that someone has or hasn't got the vaccine yet, then that why question, and trying to manage the risk on that gets broader, right? So, if they know and then they start, asking why, even in a kidding way, you can start getting yourself into trouble. Because I think people on the folks that want to be masked or have, a lot more safety versus the people that don't want the mask at all, both are very sensitive to having, their personal choice out there. And it can cause some conflict.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess in my mind, I kind of divide the knowledge issue up into two separate buckets, so to speak. One is just the sharing of information with those who need to know for purposes of enforcing the workplace safety rules about who's vaccinated or not. And then who knows, the second bucket is who knows why a person isn't vaccinated or not. Mm-hmm. The first bucket, I think, can be a broader audience or a broader group, more accurately. The second bucket should be a smaller group. So what you should really, I think the best approach would be to communicate to your managers. If you need certain managers outside of upper management to know who's vaccinated or not for purposes of enforcing the mask requirement, make sure they also know that they shouldn't be engaging in any conversation beyond that. If anything comes up with an employee about why they're vaccinated or not, they should be instructed to directed that person to HR or some other central contact to deal with that issue. It's not perfect, but I think that's one way to approach that issue.
Yeah, along those same lines, another question that came up is if someone tries to claim the health or the religious out, what type of documentation can you ask for? And I think the other thing that's not asked here, but it's also important, is how long do you have to maintain that as well?
Yeah, so you
update that question.
So for purposes or in relation to disability accommodations, yes, you can request documentation, just like you could for any other disability accommodation situation. Like, say someone has a bad back, they say they need accommodation. You say, okay, I need your doctor's note or your doctor's confirmation that you need this accommodation, or what type of accommodation might be needed. It's no different for the vaccine than it is for that bad back situation. Religious accommodations are different. The EEOC's position on requesting documentation regarding the religious belief is that employers generally should not question the sincerity of the employee's religious belief or the belief itself unless they have an objective basis to do so. My general advice to employers in that religious accommodation situation is don't get into the business of starting to question someone's religious beliefs. It generally is not going to end well for anybody unless it just truly is an outlier situation. And this isn't a pitch for my services or not, but you should probably talk to your trusted employment lawyer about that situation, just because it is somewhat unique. So on the topic of disability accommodations and religious accommodations, those are the two main exceptions to the ability to mandate vaccines. And I want to run through those pretty quickly here in terms of how do you handle one of those situations if you get it. I think the more likely scenario is the disability accommodation scenario, but they both do come up. In terms of disability accommodations, basically you have to do a two-step analysis. Number one is, does the person being unvaccinated create a risk of substantial harm to the health and safety of themselves or others if they're in the workplace? Given the fact that we're in a public health emergency and the nature of how COVID-19 is transmitted, The answer to that question is generally yes, just because if they're in the workplace, they're unvaccinated, given the science around vaccines at the moment and its ability to help prevent transmission versus being unvaccinated. Then the CDC guidance on workplace transmission, I struggle at the moment to think of a situation where an unvaccinated employee wouldn't present a direct threat. So assuming that's the case, which I think that's a safe assumption, the next step is you need to look at whether there's any reasonable accommodations for that employee to allow them to continue to do their job while also lessening or reducing that direct threat to the health and safety. If there are accommodations available, you can't exclude that employee from the workplace unless that accommodation would pose some type of undue burden. So you need to go through that traditional reasonable accommodation process, just like you would if someone came in with a bad back. So you need to talk to the employee about what accommodations might be available, whether that's continued remote work, a flexible schedule, maybe they work in a different location in the office, job modification, they continue to wear a mask, social distancing, whatever it might be. You need to go through that normal reasonable accommodation interactive process to determine whether you can manage the risk relative to that employee not being vaccinated. And as I mentioned a minute ago, you can request documentation to confirm that the employee does in fact have a disability that precludes them from getting the vaccine. And obviously I wouldn't be a management side employment lawyer unless I recommend that you just document that process, whether it's just by emails, confirming emails with the employee, those kinds of things, just so you have that in case something would come up. In terms of reasonable accommodations for a religious belief, the basic requirement is that an employer has to provide reasonable accommodations for sincerely held religious beliefs, unless that accommodation poses an undue hardship. The one additional unique twist, in addition to the documentation limitations on reasonable accommodations, is that the undue burden analysis related to an accommodation of religious belief is much more favorable to the employer, because an undue burden or undue hardship in this situation is defined as something that poses more than a de minimis cost or burden to the employer, which is a pretty low threshold in terms of when something becomes an undue burden in the religious accommodation context. Again, documentation wise, if someone comes forward and says that they have a religious belief that precludes them from getting the vaccine, unless it's a very unique situation, you should generally tread very carefully in terms of questioning the sincerity of their religious belief or the belief itself.
So here's another one that came up. It's somewhat similar to that. So can you, as part of your hiring practice, can you screen out unvaccinated candidates without it being discriminatory?
Yes, if you have a vaccine mandate. It would just be like any other workplace rule, and it would be just as it would apply to your existing employees, obviously with the caveat that you have to accommodate for disability and religious belief. Now, a couple of just, I guess, closing comments on vaccine mandates. I think the trend earlier this year and through today has been for most employers not to mandate the vaccine for a variety of different reasons. Whether it was the availability of the vaccine, just kind of like we're all getting used to the vaccine, it's a new thing. Employee morale issues. A lot of employers are having difficulty recruiting new employees or retaining employees. There's a lot of shuffling going on, those kinds of things. So for any variety of reasons, many employers just shied away from mandating the vaccine. And I tended to agree with that decision in most circumstances, unless you were kind of in a frontline healthcare provider situation or long-term care facility or something like that. I have seen some discussion recently, and I think there might be a stronger argument to make in favor of a mandate as we move forward. Now that the vaccines are more readily available, my understanding is it's pretty easy to get in there and get one these days, as well as the new shift with the mask guidance. One of the ways that you could potentially get back to a scenario where you're able to have your workplace functioning a little bit more as it did pre-pandemic is to get those vaccine numbers up amongst your workforce. And obviously a way to do that is to mandate it. So not saying that's necessarily the right answer for everybody, but it's just worth thinking about keeping all your options open, considering the nature of your business, considering your workforce, those types of things, and maybe keeping that as an option in the back of your mind as you move forward, continually reevaluating, as we all have been for the past year, in terms of what your workplace protocols and policies are relative to the pandemic. Any final questions, Tyson, on vaccines or masking before I move on to non-pandemic topics?
No, I think people are worn out on the mask and vaccines like we haven't already been for the whole year, but that was great information and awesome questions that were coming out. I think a lot of people benefited from that. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So a couple of other.
Yeah, I think the one that we're getting some questions on, if you want to slide around a little bit, is the Washington Long-Term Care Tax Act, but that's up to you. I know we're going to send these slides out to everybody.
I'll spend like 2 or 3 minutes on this, and then we can move on to the Long-Term Care Act. So this may have flew under the radar for many of you because there's so much going on right now, but as part of the last, stimulus package, which is, we're calling it ARPA, there was a COBRA subsidy in there. It's 100% COBRA subsidy in effect from April 1 through September 30. And it's funded by a tax credit on employer quarterly payroll tax returns. Employees who are either involuntarily terminated, or as I like to call, they're just fired, or they have their hours reduced for any reason. Doesn't have to be COVID related reason. So it's a layoff, reduction of business, whatever it might be. They are eligible for this subsidy. And so it's something to keep in mind if you are having employment separations, that you need to be aware of this, this new COBRA subsidy. There are some updated notices that the DOL put out. Those have to be distributed to individuals who are eligible for the subsidy, and they have to be distributed, I believe, no later than the end of this month. So if you're not aware of this, that's something you're going to want to look into. In the slide there's a link to the latest DOL guidance on this topic. There's a lot of good information in there. It doesn't address every issue, but you'll also find some updated notices in there as well that includes language for you to provide the initial eligibility notice with the normal COBRA eligibility notice, as well as there's an additional requirement under this ARPA provision. If an employee is eligible for the subsidy, they're receiving the subsidy. When the subsidy is about to end in a few months, you have to provide an additional notice at that point in time that outlines kind of what their options are as the subsidy ends. So if you're not aware of this, check out that link. Make sure that your notices are updated. If you have a plan administrator who handles your COBRA stuff, they're probably on top of it, but I would check in with them as well, just to make sure that your I's are being dotted and your T's are being crossed. And I'm always happy to answer questions about it as well, if you have any. So Washington Long-Term Care Act, this is another thing that I think this is kind of the sneaky law in Washington that many folks weren't aware of, and we're all scrambling to catch up on this one. But basically what this is it's an uncapped payroll tax of looks like 0.58% on employee wages. And the tax proceeds are going to be used to create a long-term care trust fund, which will provide benefits for Washington residents for long-term care. I believe the total lifetime benefit is set at about $36,000 and change. That will be adjusted for inflation over time. The big, important date here that many of us are scrambling to address is the tax becomes effective on January 1 of 2022. So just in a few short months here, that tax will be effective. There is a rollout period where the benefits don't become available, I think, until 2025 is the date. But for most employer and employee purposes, I think the date they probably really care about is the effective date of the tax. It does cover all employees who work in the states. Determining whether an employee works in the state or not is determined by a localization concept. It's a similar concept that's used under Washington paid family medical leave. Basically, obviously, if the employee works in Washington primarily, they're going to be covered by this and subject to the tax. There are some specific scenarios where if someone doesn't necessarily work all the time in Washington, that they are covered, but those are somewhat unique. And if you have those scenarios come up, I'm happy to talk about those. But just be aware that there are some employees outside of just your traditional working in Washington all the time that might be covered. For those of you who might have employees covered by a CBA, this doesn't apply to two CBAs that were in existence. I believe the date is October 19th of 2017. And until that agreement either expires or it's reopened or renegotiated. At that point in time, the tax would be something that we need to consider in the CBA.
Hey, Jim, I think this is worth just saying again. So the question is, if an employee works out of state for a Washington-based employer, are they subject to the tax? So Washington employer, but they're working, say, in Oregon.
If they're working in Oregon for a Washington employer and they're primarily in Oregon, I don't believe they'll be covered by the tax. They'll be subject to the tax.
Because they're no longer a Washington employee.
Yeah, and it can get a little nuanced if they live in Washington but work in Oregon for a Washington employer. That kind of thing, that sounds like a law school question. But if they live in Oregon, they work in Oregon, they just happen to work for a Washington employer, maybe they come here incidentally. My gut says they won't be covered by the tax in that situation.
Yeah, we see that with the remote employees a lot. That's kind of this hybrid thing that we're seeing out there. And that's the next question is what if there's a percentage? Do they have to pay the percentage that they're an Washington employee versus, say, an Oregon or an Idaho employee? We have two borders, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen anything on that. I know that comes up with like Oregon income tax. Typically, and at least with my experience with Washington paid family medical leave, which uses the same localization concept, the feedback I've gotten from ESD on this issue is it's more of an all or nothing thing. Either you're a Washington employee or you're not for this purpose. But that's one of the things we'll have to just kind of maybe monitor the regulations on as they come out in the next couple of months to get a better sense of.
Yeah. So just a quick, so there's an acronym in there. So not everyone knows what CBA. So that's collective bargaining agreement. So for unions generally, right? Yeah.
Yes. Sorry about that.
No, that's all right. Save some space doing that.
Yeah. A couple of other things employers should be aware of. Number one, obviously, is an employer responsible for collecting the tax via payroll withholding and then remitting it over to ESD, similar like you would for unemployment. There is an opt-out window for this. So if an employee has a private long-term care policy, they have the ability to apply to opt out with ESD, but there's this narrow window. And I believe the current window, and this has shifted a few times, but I believe the current window is October 1 of this year through December 31 of next year. And so during that window, if you have that private long-term care policy, you apply to ESD to opt out. They give you the thumbs up on the opt out. Then you as the employee have to then provide that documentation to the employer so they know not to do the withholding from your paycheck. So that is on the employee's shoulders to go ahead and get that done and give that information to the employer so they know. I think it's a good step now to start to maybe communicate with your employees as we get into the summer that this is coming down the pike and that this opt-out window is relatively short, and that if they're going to opt out, they need to give you that information, especially for your higher wage earners. If you have higher wage earners, Tyson and I have talked about this quite a bit. There's a lot of value in those folks go ahead and opting out and getting their own policy just because they might get better benefits. It's going to be cheaper for them. Question?
Yeah. So the question came up, and this is related to the opt-out. So can the employer pay, this is asking about the premiums, but essentially pay the tax on behalf of the employees? So employers can purchase a long-term care policy that could qualify for the opt-out, but I think the thing to remember there, and not to speak for you, Jim, but this one of those areas that we live in a little bit, is that the opt-out's only once. So if you buy a policy for your employees now, you're going to help them, but you're still going to be hiring people in the future. And so you're still going to have to deal with whether they opted out from the other employer or not, and still be able to, not collect the tax or collect the tax. But if you bought a policy for everybody, then you would also be buying the policy for those future people that may not have opted out. And so now you're collecting the tax and paying for a benefit for them. So it's just one of those things employers have to decide on what they want to do.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for sharing that. Are you seeing, what are you seeing in your experience, how employers are handling this? Are you seeing lots of employers maybe look into having policies available for employees?
There was a lot of quoting when the opt-out was July 24th, but as it pushed to November 1st, because people felt that they had more time to be able to evaluate it, we're seeing more employers basically saying that they're going to educate the employee on what their options are, which is, get an opt-out policy or we're going to collect the tax. Some companies are doing a class out, which means that, say, for managers or those high wage earners that you're talking about, that they're buying a policy for them. And then for others, they're educating that, the others on, hey, you can get a policy, but you're going to have to do that on your own, or buy a voluntary program potentially through the employer. So those are probably the most common. I think the education is really the key. And the other thing for the opt-out side of things is that because there's so much quoting going on, and particularly if it's an individual policy, those things are going to take 2 to 3 months to actually get in place. And so if you know that November 1st is your drop dead date, then you got to go backwards 2 or 3 months. So really, employees need to start taking action probably at the latest by August to be able to get that thing in place and not buying a policy that's not going to show up in time.
Okay, that's really great information. Thanks for sharing that. I think the employee education piece of this is key. Again, especially if you have those higher wage earners. I've talked to quite a few folks about this, and they had no idea it was coming, and you're starting to scramble to get some options put in place to be able to opt out, because it was going to be to their benefit, both financially and then as well as the benefit itself, which, as Tyson mentioned, there's only really one opt-out. There is only one opt-out window currently. But if you don't opt out and you go into the fund and you start paying, you could pay for 20 years. And if you move out of Washington, you're not eligible for benefits. You have to be in Washington at the time. So there's a lot of scenarios where employees will benefit from opting out. So that employee education part of it is key.
Yeah, I think it's important on the opt-out side is the people to understand, and this is where the education comes in. If you've got an employee between the ages of 20 and 30 right now, based off of the current tax, and they can reevaluate how much they're charging every 2 years, that person is projected to spend almost $100,000 in tax by the time they retire. And so, those younger people, you think, hey, they're not making a lot of money, let's do the tax. Well, if you think about the benefits, 36,500, the math doesn't work very well. Now things can change, but those are things to think about. I don't know if you have this in another slide too. I know we're starting to run out of time here, but there is a buy-in period for this. And so if you have a worker that's in their late 50s, it's a really good idea to consider. They may want to opt out. Doesn't really matter about their income either, because they may not be able to buy in long enough for the policy, for the actually to take advantage of the Washington state policy.
Yeah. Well, that number you gave on the tax over the lifetime of a 20 to 30-year-old working lifetime is kind of stunning. So it's
Yeah.
worth thinking about. Yeah, for sure. I know we're up on the time here. So I did have on the slides some information on Oregon paid family medical leave. This actually works really, really well because there's currently a bill going through the Oregon legislature, which sounds like it's probably going to pass, which would push back implementation a year. So currently Oregon paid family medical leave was scheduled, taxes were scheduled to start on Jan 1 of 2022, and then benefits were scheduled to start on Jan 1 of 2023. If that bill passes, then those respective dates are going to be pushed back a year and a year each. That looks like that can is going to get kicked down the road a little bit, but that information is in the slides just about what is in Oregon paid family medical leave. It looks a lot like Washington. So those of you in Washington will be familiar with a lot of the concepts. But just keep an eye on that front in terms of whether that delay is passed and implemented.
Yeah. So, Jim, I appreciate all the time and the information. I know we were trying to pack in a lot. I think the pushing out of Oregon helped get as much information as it could in here. And that mask thing really is new news, and so it's good that we could take the time to do that. So, thanks for presenting. We're going to send out a copy of these slides out to everybody, the recording, Jim's contact information, and ours here at Biggs too. So if you have any questions, we're here to help, and we know there's a lot of information. So let's just, we just want to make sure everything's clear and you're able to connect.
Yeah, thanks, Tyson. And I know I see a lot of questions in the chat, and I know we jammed a lot of information in here, like I said. So, feel free, like Tyson said, to shoot either one of us an email.
Yeah.
I might not get back to you for a few days, but I promise I'm not ignoring you. I will get back to you, most likely over the weekend.
Super. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye.